Imagine waking up one February morning in 1995 to see headlines screaming that Barings Bank, the oldest merchant bank in Britain, had just gone bankrupt. We're talking about a bank so old it once managed Queen Elizabeth's personal finances and financed global trade for more than 2 centuries. And yet, just like that, it was gone. A single trader sitting thousands of miles away in Singapore had brought the entire institution to its knees. Crazy, right? Well, buckle up because we're diving deep into how that happened. The collapse of Barings wasn't just a financial accident, it was a full-blown implosion that revealed the soft underbelly of modern finance. Everyone thought big banks were these indestructible fortresses, built on impeccable control and discipline. But what if one overconfident, under-supervised trader could hide hundreds of millions in losses without anyone noticing? That question ripped through London's financial district like wildfire, and soon the answer would make everyone painfully aware of how fragile trust can be in the world of money. To understand the shock, you need to get just how iconic Barings was. Founded in 1762, it was basically the grandparent of British banking. This was the kind of institution that financed wars, built empires, and advised monarchs. The Barings name carried a level of prestige that made it seem untouchable. In many ways, it represented the old guard of finance. Stiff suits, cigar smoke, and oak-paneled offices. So when news broke that this monument of tradition had been destroyed by a 30-something trader no one had even heard of, disbelief was an understatement. Now, think about this for a second. How much damage can one person really cause inside a giant financial machine? You might assume some kind of oversight would stop a single bad actor, right? Multiple layers of approval, risk checks, senior managers signing off. It should be impossible for anyone to take down an entire bank. But here's where it gets wild. Nick Leeson, a relatively young trader stationed in Singapore, managed to bypass all of that. He didn't just lose money, he lost more than £800 million before anyone back home had a clue. Let's rewind for a moment and set the scene. The early 1990s were a time of expansion for global banks, and Barings wanted to modernize its operations. They saw Asia, particularly Singapore, as the new frontier for financial innovation. Futures markets were booming there. If you don't know, futures are basically contracts that let you agree today on the price of something you'll buy or sell later. They can be insanely profitable, but also catastrophically risky. Barings sent their ambitious young trader, Nick Leeson, to ride that wave in the Singapore International Monetary Exchange, or SIMEX for short. Back in London, the executives couldn't have been prouder. All they saw were profits flowing from Asia, and as long as the numbers looked good, nobody was asking too many questions. Typical story, right? As long as you're showing profits, you get the champagne. The reality, however, was far different. Beneath the surface of Leeson's apparently stellar performance, a disaster was quietly growing. A disaster so complex and yet so human, it would become a textbook case of financial failure. Here's where you and I start peeling away the layers. Barings wasn't destroyed in a single moment of panic or one bad investment. The collapse was a process. A slow, hidden buildup of small deceptions that looked harmless until they weren't. Leeson, trying to cover up some early trading mistakes, used what's known as an error account. That's basically a record to temporarily park transactions gone wrong until they can be sorted out. Nothing shady about that, right? Except his account, labeled 88888, became the black hole into which he dumped every loss he didn't want his bosses to see. Now pause for a moment, because this is where the red flags start waving. Why didn't London notice millions leaking through a mysterious account? Why didn't the internal audits catch on? The short answer: they were asleep at the wheel. Leeson was both the trader and the head of operations in Singapore, which is like being both the detective and the suspect in the same case. Checks and balances only work when two different people are doing the checking and the balancing. In Barings' case, the system had been designed in a way that let the wolf guard the henhouse. By the time anyone smelled trouble, the situation was completely out of control. Leeson's fake profits had kept everyone happy for years. Remember, the more money he appeared to make, the more bonuses his bosses earned, and the more prestige the bank gained. Nobody wanted to look too closely. And that's a recurring theme in finance, by the way. As long as everyone's making money, nobody asks uncomfortable questions. It's only when the music stops that you realize half the chairs are gone. But even if management was negligent, it's hard to ignore the intoxicating power of success. Imagine you're a young trader far from home, pulling off trades that make you look like a genius. Colleagues praise you. Headlines call you a prodigy. It's easy to start believing you really can't lose. What began as minor cover-ups turned into desperate gambles. Leeson started doubling down, trying to win back the losses before anyone found out. This is a psychological trap that has destroyed not just traders, but entire economies. The fear of admitting you were wrong. Here's the twist, though. From a distance, Barings still looked like a thriving institution. The London offices were buzzing, payments kept rolling, and clients remained confident. In other words, the house looked beautiful from the outside even as the foundations were collapsing inside. That's what makes this story so terrifying. It wasn't an external attack or a market crash that destroyed Barings. It was a slow internal rot covered with pretty numbers and fake reports. Then came February in 1995, when everything unraveled before the world's eyes. A massive trading loss linked to Japanese stock index futures popped up on the radar. At first, it seemed like just another temporary setback. Big banks dealt with those all the time. But as investigators looked into it, they realized they couldn't trace the transactions properly. London started calling Singapore for explanations, and Leeson was nowhere to be found. The facade had crumbled at last. When the truth came out, it was staggering. Nick Leeson had lost £827 million, nearly twice the bank's available capital. In simpler terms, that meant Barings owed way more than it could ever pay back. Picture it like a household trying to pay off a mortgage with monopoly money. The losses didn't just empty the coffers, they vaporized trust itself. By the time the Bank of England stepped in, Barings was already a corpse. The fallout spread faster than anyone could contain it. Employees lost their jobs overnight. The Barings name, centuries of credibility, and the trust of global clients evaporated in a matter of hours. Within days, the mighty Dutch bank ING swooped in and bought the remains of Barings for, wait for it, just one symbolic £1. Imagine that. A bank that had once financed global expansion sold for less than a coffee. Everywhere you looked, people were asking the same question. How could this happen? How could the oldest British bank be destroyed by one rogue trader? The answer wasn't just about Leeson's actions. It was about a system that allowed one person to operate unchecked. Weak internal controls, poor communication between offices, and a culture that rewarded success without questioning its origins. It was the perfect storm waiting to explode. For you as a viewer, this story is more than history. It's a mirror. It shows how fragile complex systems can be when human emotion gets mixed with financial power. The collapse of Barings wasn't about malicious intent at the start. It was about pride, denial, and a misplaced sense of invincibility. Leeson didn't set out to become a villain. He became one step by step, trade by trade, lie by lie. The irony is painful. Barings survived wars, global recessions, and political revolutions, only to be undone by bad trades and worse management. It's a reminder that reputations mean nothing if they're not backed by accountability. It also exposes a harsh truth. Many of the systems we trust today, from from banks to governments to corporations, depend on people doing the right thing even when no one's watching. And as this story proves, that isn't always the case. You might be thinking, this was nearly 30 years ago. Surely things have changed. Well, yes and no. The collapse of Barings did trigger major reforms in financial supervision and risk management. But the human factor remains stubbornly unpredictable. Every few years, another rogue trader makes headlines with similar losses. Different names, same playbook, which begs the question, have we really learned anything since then? As we move through this series, you'll see exactly how Nick Leeson pulled off the impossible, how he manipulated the system, fooled his superiors, and ultimately brought down an empire. But remember, today's story isn't only about a man or a single bank. It's about the fragility of trust in a world where money moves faster than reason. So grab a coffee, because next, we'll meet the man behind the chaos and see how a small-town guy from England ended up holding the fate of a legendary bank in his hands. Let's rewind a bit before the chaos and meet the man behind one of the most infamous financial disasters in history. Nick Leeson wasn't born into privilege. He wasn't a polished Oxford graduate, and he definitely wasn't part of the London elite that usually filled the banking halls. He came from Watford, a modest town just outside of London, where his parents worked normal jobs. His dad was a plasterer, and his mom worked in a factory. You could say he was the ultimate outsider in a world that worshipped pedigree. From early on, Leeson wasn't particularly academic, but he had something that many banks secretly value just as much: ambition and hustle. He didn't go to university. Instead, he jumped straight into the workforce, starting as a back-office clerk in a local financial firm. You know, the kind of role where you spend your day pushing paperwork and making sure numbers line up for people far more important than you. But for Nick, that job was his foot in the door. He studied how the system worked and quietly began climbing the ranks. By the mid-1980s, Leeson had found his place at Morgan Stanley before eventually being recruited by Barings Bank. This was his chance to prove he belonged among the financial elite. The funny part, Barings at that time still had this old-fashioned aura. Very privileged, very traditional. So when Leeson showed up from his working-class background, he didn't fit the mold. But what he lacked in polish, he made up for in energy and results. Management noticed, and it wasn't long before he was on track for something bigger. Let's stop here for a second, because this is important. In the world of finance, confidence can often be mistaken for competence. Leeson had tons of the former, and for a while, it was enough. In an environment obsessed with fast profits, ambitious employees like him were gold. He gave his bosses what they wanted: good numbers and impressive profits, never mind the long-term risks. To them, Leeson wasn't just another employee. He was the bright face of Barings' expansion into Asia. Now picture the late 1980s and early 90s. Banking was going global, fast. New technology made it possible to trade in markets across continents, and suddenly, young traders could make or lose millions before lunch. Barings saw this new frontier and decided to jump in. They looked to Singapore, one of the hottest trading hubs in Asia, with exploding futures markets. When they needed someone to pioneer that business, they picked their energetic rising star, Nick Leeson. For him, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Here's where things start to get interesting. Leeson's job in Singapore wasn't just about executing trades. He also had to manage the back-office operations. That might sound boring, but it's actually crucial. The back office is where trades are recorded, settled, and confirmed. It's where the books balance. In a properly designed system, those roles should be separate, with different people checking each other's work. But Barings, eager to save money and trusting their golden boy, put Leeson in charge of both. Imagine sending a fox to manage the chicken coop. It's essentially what happened. At first, everything looked perfect. Leeson was making profits hand over fist. London executives were thrilled. The press called him a genius, and his colleagues at the Singapore International Monetary Exchange started treating him like a star. He had the lifestyle to match: fancy suits, a nice apartment, and the respect of a growing team. When you're that young and successful, it's easy to start believing your own hype. In Leeson's mind, he wasn't just a trader, he was rewriting the rulebook. But traders live and die by numbers, and success can be dangerously addictive. Every win makes you feel smarter, while every loss whispers that maybe you're not as invincible as you thought. That's where the psychological spiral begins. One bad trade is embarrassing. 2 can ruin your reputation, and 3 can end your career. So, what do you do when the numbers turn against you? You hide them, just for a little while. At least, that's what Leeson told himself. His career up to that point had taught him one dangerous lesson: short-term success mattered more than sustainable integrity. Each time his managers congratulated him for record profits, that belief got stronger. They didn't ask how the money was made. They just saw the results. Leeson figured that as long as he kept delivering, nobody would ever look too closely. And unfortunately for Barings, he was absolutely right. Let's talk about something that shaped Leeson's mindset: the combination of youth, isolation, and pressure. Singapore was far from London, both geographically and culturally. He was leading a team in a foreign land, with minimal oversight and enormous expectations. Think about it. He was just in his late 20s, managing millions in client funds, taking trades that could shift markets. That kind of responsibility can mess with your head, especially when you're thousands of miles away from your bosses, who only see the wins. In psychology, there's something called the illusion of control. It's the belief that you can manage complex outcomes that are actually mostly random. Traders fall for this all the time, and Leeson was no exception. Every time one of his risky positions paid off, he felt smarter, more capable, untouchable even. And every time the market turned against him, he rationalized it as a temporary dip he could fix with a bigger bet. It was a game of mental ping-pong that blurred the line between confidence and delusion. To his credit, Leeson wasn't dumb. He understood how derivatives worked, and he exploited that knowledge. Derivatives are financial contracts whose value depends on something else, say, a stock index, a commodity price, or even interest rates. They're powerful tools when used carefully, but like a high-performance car, they're also easy to crash. Leeson used derivatives to make bets on the direction of the Japanese stock market, specifically the Nikkei index. When he guessed right, the profits were spectacular. When he guessed wrong, the losses multiplied fast. But remember, Barings loved those early wins. They saw the headlines about their Singapore office generating record returns and assumed everything was under control. The fact that one of their traders was both executing and reporting trades barely raised a question. The attitude at the top was something like, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." That complacency, combined with their trust in a young trader who was just too good to doubt, set them up for disaster. By 1993, Leeson's operation in Singapore was considered the crown jewel of Barings' expansion. He attended gala dinners, gave presentations, and had senior executives practically tripping over themselves to shake his hand. A sense of arrogance began to develop, not just in Leeson, but across the institution. They all wanted to believe this young man was their ticket to modern financial glory. It was a classic case of institutional blindness. When you want something to be true badly enough, you stop seeing the red flags. But behind closed doors, Leeson was battling mounting pressure. Not all his trades were as successful as he made them look. Every time a big loss hit, he used that infamous error account we mentioned earlier to hide it. And because he controlled the reporting process, those hidden losses never saw the light of day. The accounting trick worked so well that his fake profits began offsetting the missing millions. On paper, everything looked impeccable. In reality, the hole was growing every week. Now let's pause again. Have you ever told a small lie that snowballed into something much bigger? That's exactly what happened here. Except instead of lying about being late to dinner, Leeson was lying about tens of millions in market losses. Every time he promised himself that he'd fix it soon, the markets would turn again, and the losses doubled. He wasn't thinking long-term anymore. His goal was simply to survive another day without getting caught. From a storytelling point of view, this is where the tension really starts to build. Leeson isn't an obvious villain. He's more like a tragic character trapped in a web of his own making. He wanted to be successful so badly that he crossed the invisible line between ambition and deceit. The crazy part is, management kept cheering him on. They gave him more money to trade, more freedom, more praise, completely unaware that their so-called star trader was actually digging their grave. If you step back and look at this story through the lens of psychology and human behavior, it's a perfect storm of systemic failure and personal weakness. Barings failed to create boundaries. Their culture rewarded short-term profit without accountability. Leeson thrived in that kind of environment because it gave him both power and plausible deniability. As long as he looked successful, he was safe. And once he wasn't, it was already too late. So, when you see that famous clip of Nick Leeson being escorted in handcuffs years later, remember he didn't start out as a criminal mastermind. He started out as a guy who wanted to impress his bosses and make something of himself in a world that didn't think he belonged. Ambition is powerful, but when mixed with pressure and lack of oversight, it becomes combustible. By the time 1994 rolled around, Leeson's empire in Singapore was still a glittering success story on paper. Barings executives in London toasted his achievements, while auditors glossed over confusing reports. Nobody wanted to poke the golden goose. And as long as Leeson kept the illusion alive, the danger kept growing. You might be wondering, when did it all become irreversible? At what moment did Leeson cross the point of no return? That's what we'll uncover next. Because soon, the trades that made him a star would become the very thing that exposed his deception. In the next part, we'll peel apart how he gamed the system, and how a series of disastrous bets, hidden under one innocent-looking account, set Barings Bank on a direct path to extinction. So here's where things really start to get wild. Everything we've seen so far, the rise of Nick Leeson, the trust from Barings, the illusion of endless success, was just the setup. This is the part where the illusion turns into deception, and the numbers that once made Leeson a star start morphing into a ticking time bomb. What he built in Singapore wasn't just a trading operation. It was a house of cards that looked solid right up until the last second. Let's break it down step by step. The first key to understanding Leeson's scam is what's called an unauthorized trade. That's any trade made without the approval of a superior or outside the limits set by the firm. Banks set these boundaries for a reason. They're like seatbelts, there to protect you from yourself. But Leeson unbuckled those restraints early on. Every time he placed a trade without consent, he was essentially driving blindfolded at full speed. In the beginning, the deception was small. He made a few bets that didn't go his way and didn't want to admit it. So he parked the losses in a hidden ledger that he named Account 88888. Sounds almost mystical, doesn't it? In Chinese culture, the number 8 symbolizes luck and fortune. But for Barings, this sequence of 8s became the symbol of their doom. The so-called error account was supposed to correct minor discrepancies between buys and sells. Leeson, however, turned it into a bottomless pit that swallowed every disaster he created. Now you might be thinking, how could one man hide millions without anyone noticing? It seems impossible, but remember, Leeson was both the front and the back office. He executed trades and then confirmed them himself. It's like taking an exam and grading your own paper. Nobody was double-checking him. Barings' London office received smooth reports showing massive profits. And those reports were the same ones Leeson authored. The control system wasn't just weak, it was non-existent. Let's talk about what those trades actually were. Leeson specialized in derivatives, particularly futures and options related to the Japanese stock market. Don't worry if that sounds complicated. Here's the short version. A future is a contract to buy or sell something later at a price you decide today. It's basically a bet on where prices will go. An option is similar, but with a twist. You have the right to make the trade if it suits you, but not the obligation. These tools can be used for hedging, reducing risk, or speculation, taking risk for profit. Leeson went all in on the second one. His basic strategy was built on what's known as an arbitrage trade. This means trying to profit from tiny price differences in the same asset across two markets. In theory, it's pretty safe. Buy low in one place, sell high in another. But Leeson twisted the approach. Instead of following safe arbitrage, he started taking massive directional bets on the future of the Nikkei index. If the index went up, he made money. If it went down, he lost, sometimes catastrophically. And since he hid those losses, no one ever stopped him. By now, the error account had become its own monster. Leeson would transfer bad trades there, label them as error corrections, and pretend they didn't exist. Meanwhile, he continued reporting fake profits from trades that weren't real. It was a self-feeding illusion. Each fake profit justified bigger trades. Each bigger trade caused bigger losses. The spiral had officially begun. And believe it or not, he convinced himself he could still win it all back. You might ask, why didn't the auditors in London catch this? After all, we're talking about hundreds of millions in hidden losses. The truth is, Barings' culture was blind to scrutiny. They were so eager to expand their presence in Asia that they didn't want to risk slowing down the Golden Boy's momentum. His colleagues admired him. His superiors trusted him. External auditors saw neat paperwork and glowing performance reports. Nobody wanted to dig deeper because the story was just too good to question. This is where human psychology meets financial systems, and the results are disastrous. When everything seems to be going well, you stop looking for faults. It's called confirmation bias. You focus on information that confirms what you already believe. Leeson's bosses believed he was a genius, so any irregularity was brushed aside. The few employees who raised doubts were either ignored or overruled. Inside Barings, anyone skeptical of Leeson's results was made to feel like they didn't understand the magic of modern banking. At this stage, his personal life also started reflecting the chaos brewing beneath the surface. Long hours, incredible pressure, and a deepening web of lies were taking their toll. He was making fake entries, juggling multiple accounts, and constantly improvising explanations. Imagine the exhaustion of keeping so many lies alive while still pretending to be a success story. Leeson later admitted he was terrified but paralyzed, unable to turn back or confess, hoping somehow it would all balance out in the end. The deeper he went, the harder it became to escape. Every time he lost money, he made even riskier trades trying to recover it. It's a classic gambler's fallacy, the belief that one big win can erase a history of losses. But markets don't care about your feelings. They don't care if you're desperate, brilliant, or afraid. They just move, often against you. Leeson started betting enormous sums on interest rate changes and stock market directions, and by late 1994, his error account showed losses that no miracle could fix. Let's get into some numbers, because the scale of this is mind-blowing. By the time Barings began to sense that something was off, Leeson's secret losses were nearing £600 million. That's more than the total trading capital of the entire bank. In any sane organization, that would have triggered full-blown panic, but Barings still didn't realize it. On paper, the Singapore office looked like its most profitable branch. Leeson had turned fiction into financial reality, and no one dared call it out. Now imagine him sitting in his office in Singapore late at night. The screens glowing, numbers flashing, the weight of the entire bank silently pressing on his shoulders. Every trade a roll of the dice, every mistake a deeper plunge into disaster. When he left the office, he didn't go home relaxed. He carried that terror with him. He must have known it couldn't last forever, but like a man running on a cliff edge, he kept going because stopping would mean immediate exposure. There's a phrase traders use: cut your losses early. Leeson did the opposite. He kept doubling down, believing that one more lucky break could save him. It's ironic, really. The same ambition that made him successful in the beginning became his downfall. Every system has limits. He just refused to see them. Each fake report delayed the truth, but it also made the explosion at the end much bigger. Let's talk about the systemic failure behind this. A healthy bank separates its functions. Traders trade, accountants reconcile, and managers supervise. At Barings, those lines were blurred beyond recognition. Putting Leeson in charge of both trading and operations was like giving the keys to the vault to the same person who managed the alarm system. When regulators later analyzed the case, they discovered dozens of ignored warning signs, phone logs, inconsistent statements, missing confirmations, all of it right there, waiting to be noticed. Yet no one acted. Culturally, Barings also had a problem of arrogance. Many of its London executives came from privileged backgrounds, where hierarchy and status mattered more than technical understanding. They didn't really grasp how the new Asian futures markets worked. So when Leeson's team produced spectacular numbers, they smiled, nodded, and cashed their bonuses. In their minds, Asia was doing something clever and exotic, and if that meant they didn't fully understand it, so be it. The irony is that Leeson's reports were actually filled with contradictions that any diligent investigator could have spotted. Profit figures didn't match bank statements. Some positions were reported twice. Confirmations from counterparties were missing or incomplete. There were even occasions when he signed documents as both trader and auditor, something that should have screamed fraud from miles away. But because he had a reputation for delivering, his word was accepted without question. This pattern, unchecked success breeding complacency, isn't unique to Barings. It's a recurring theme throughout financial history. Whenever profits come too easily, caution disappears. The collapse of Barings wasn't caused by technology or global markets. It was caused by human blind spots. Everyone involved wanted to believe they were witnessing genius, not realizing that genius sometimes hides its mistakes behind a curtain of confidence. By the end of 1994, Leeson's secret empire was on the brink. The stress was unbearable. The walls were closing in. Still, he couldn't bring himself to stop. In his mind, one more lucky trade could turn everything around. He wasn't stealing money to enrich himself. He was stealing time, trying to delay the inevitable. The difference didn't matter when the outcome was total collapse. When we call him a rogue trader, it's not just a financial term, it's a symbol of isolation. A rogue trader operates in the dark, unnoticed by the system meant to control them. It's what happens when trust and technology outgrow discipline. The lesson here isn't about one man's greed. It's about an industry's vulnerability to its own illusions. If you've ever wondered how something as structured as a bank could be fooled this completely, this is the answer. Systems don't fail because of computers. They fail because people ignore reality. Leeson's magic worked as long as nobody asked the wrong questions. The minute someone did, the illusion would shatter. And soon, real-world chaos was waiting to do just that. So the stage was set. Leeson's fake empire was wobbling. The market was poised for turbulence, and fate was about to play its cruelest card. In early 1995, an unexpected event in Japan turned every risk he had taken into catastrophe. In the next chapter, we'll watch that perfect storm form: earthquakes, collapsing indexes, desperate moves, and the final fall of the oldest bank in Britain. When you look back at financial history, there are moments when everything that can go wrong does. Those are the perfect storms, the ones born from bad decisions, bad luck, and timing so cruel it feels personal. By early 1995, Nick Leeson was already standing on the edge of a financial cliff, trying to make sense of a mountain of hidden losses. What he didn't know was that itself was about to kick the last stone loose. On the morning of January 17, 1995, Japan was rocked by the Great Hanshin earthquake, more commonly known as the Kobe earthquake. It struck with such force that over 5,000 lives were lost, and vast areas of Kobe, one of Japan's key industrial cities, were reduced to rubble. The human tragedy alone was staggering, but financial markets also trembled in response. The Nikkei, Japan's main stock index, dropped immediately as investors panicked. And Leeson's portfolio, which was heavily leveraged in bets that depended on the Nikkei going up, imploded in real time. Imagine being in his shoes for a second. You've been hiding £500 million in losses, juggling fake accounts, and now an earthquake you didn't cause suddenly blows up your entire strategy. Most of us would panic, maybe even confess. Leeson, though, did what he always did. He doubled down. Convinced he could turn it all around, he placed even bigger trades. It was like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. Every move only making the water rise faster. For a brief moment, there was still hope. Markets sometimes bounce back after shocking events. If that had happened in this case, maybe his plan would have worked. But luck was nowhere to be found. The Nikkei continued sliding, and soon his losses multiplied again. The numbers were insane. Each point drop in the index cost Barings millions, and when you multiply that across Leeson's oversized positions, the damage was growing by the hour. Now here's where the story turns from crisis to catastrophe. Leeson wasn't just losing money. He was losing control of the narrative. Every morning, reports were being sent to London claiming everything was under control. Those reports were works of fiction. Every profit line forged, every statement polished. Meanwhile, real losses were mounting in the error account, which had ballooned far beyond anything imaginable. The total exposure he had created was bigger than the entire capital of Barings Bank. The energy inside Barings' Singapore office during those days must have felt electric and terrifying all at once. Traders sensed something was off. The volume of Leeson's trades was absurd. He was betting more than anyone else on the exchange, moving markets by himself. Still, he projected confidence, smiling, joking, pretending everything was under control. It was an Oscar-worthy performance, but behind that facade was a man barely keeping panic at bay. When you think about it, his behavior followed a pattern that repeats in almost every financial crisis: the belief that one more move can undo all your mistakes. Leeson believed that a rebound in the Nikkei would fix everything. And you know what? For a few days, it looked like it might. The market stabilized for a moment, and he thought his luck had finally turned. But that illusion quickly shattered when new aftershocks hit, both literally and financially. At this point, his losses exceeded £700 million. But no one in London had an idea. How does that happen? Simple. They didn't want to believe it could. Confirmation bias again. The same mental blindfold that had protected Leeson all along. The people upstairs saw only what they wanted to see, not the chaos underneath. They were getting ready for bonuses, corporate parties, and strategy meetings while the real business was already bleeding to death. February rolled in, and with it came the breaking point. The false profits that Leeson used to balance the books no longer hid the growing void. His liquidity dried up. There was simply no more cash to cover the margin calls from the exchange. A margin call, by the way, is like your broker asking for extra cash when your investments lose value. If you can't pay, you're forced to close your positions at a loss. For Leeson, that meant the game was almost over. In the finance world, panic always spreads faster than truth. Once other traders sensed irregularities in Barings' positions, rumors began swirling through Singapore's financial community.
Calls started coming in from counterparties who wanted reassurance that payments would arrive. Those calls reached London too. But even then, senior managers were convinced it was just operational noise, some temporary accounting issue. It's almost painful to picture. The calm ignorance of people about to face one of the worst days of their careers. The final domino fell around late February. Leeson left a note on his desk that simply read, "I'm sorry," and disappeared from Singapore. By the time senior executives realized he was gone, his accounts were being frozen by the exchange. Investigators started digging through the paperwork, and it didn't take long for the truth to surface. The mysterious error account wasn't holding small mistakes. It was holding Barings' entire downfall. Now think about this from a human perspective. One day, you're sitting in your London office, believing your Singapore branch is your crown jewel. The next, you're finding out it has destroyed your bank. Shock, disbelief, anger, you name it. The auditors and analysts scrambled to compute the actual exposure, and each new number was worse than the last. When they finally tallied it, the damage exceeded £800 million. The whole bank was insolvent. At this point, panic spread like wildfire. Creditors demanded repayment. Other financial institutions refused to lend Barings money. Employees, once proud of working for such a prestigious institution, suddenly faced unemployment overnight. The Bank of England tried to coordinate a rescue, but the gap was just too large. Barings didn't have liquidity, assets, or trust left. Within a few days, the oldest bank in the United Kingdom was bankrupt. But let's not forget that this perfect storm wasn't purely about one man's bad trades. The earthquake was just the spark. The real explosion came from years of weak oversight, corporate arrogance, and misplaced faith in numbers that looked too good to be true. If Barings had enforced proper control systems, this story would have ended as a scandal, not a catastrophe. Instead, it became a symbol of how fragile global finance can be. It's haunting to think how small decisions compounded into a global event. Each time Leeson falsified a report, each time a manager ignored a red flag, the chain of failure got stronger. And when the earthquake hit, it wasn't just shaking buildings, it was shaking an entire illusion. Markets reveal truth faster than people are willing to accept it, and this was one of those brutal reminders. From a wider angle, the collapse triggered a ripple effect across banks worldwide. Risk departments suddenly woke up. Everyone wanted to review their internal controls, audit processes, and staff responsibilities. Regulators analyzed the case for years afterward, trying to ensure it couldn't happen again. In a twisted way, Leeson became an unintentional teacher, a cautionary tale that forced the industry to mature. Yet it's hard to forget the human cost behind those reforms. Hundreds of employees lost their livelihoods through no fault of their own. Many never worked in finance again. Barings' reputation, once untouchable, was shattered beyond repair. Within days, the legendary institution was sold to ING, a Dutch bank, for one symbolic pound. That tiny transaction represented centuries of history wiped out in a single swipe. So what can we learn from this perfect storm? First, the illusion of control is incredibly dangerous. Whether it's trading or life decisions, believing you can outsmart chaos often leads to disaster. Second, institutions built on trust can collapse overnight if they stop questioning themselves. Barings didn't fail because of one earthquake. It failed because it ignored the small tremors long before. There's another lesson in this story about systems and accountability. A healthy structure doesn't rely on individual heroes. It relies on processes that work even when people don't. Leeson became both the hero and the villain of his story because the system made room for that duality. When unchecked ambition meets structural weakness, it always ends the same way. It's not just about money. It's about how humans handle power when no one is watching. By the time Leeson was found and arrested in Germany, it was too late for Barings. The media painted him as the ultimate rogue trader, the man who destroyed the empire. But the truth, as you now know, is more layered than that. He didn't destroy Barings alone. He only exposed what was already rotten underneath. The perfect storm didn't come out of nowhere. It had been brewing for years. And that's the real twist, isn't it? The storm wasn't a natural disaster. It was a human one. An earthquake might have sparked the end, but the foundation crumbled because greed, pride, and negligence built a fragile house. So, if you ever find yourself in a system where everything seems too good to be true, maybe stop and ask, who's checking the numbers? Because as we'll see in the next chapter, when Barings finally fell, the aftershocks didn't just hit its employees, they changed global finance forever. When the news broke that Barings Bank had fallen, the shockwaves went far beyond London's financial district. This wasn't some small hedge fund blowing up or a startup bank collapsing under bad debt. This was a 200-year-old institution that had financed governments, traded with empires, and carried the trust of the British Crown. Overnight, it became the poster child of how arrogance and negligence can bring giants to their knees. Everyone wanted answers. How could a single trader wreck the oldest bank in the United Kingdom? And why didn't anyone stop him? Let's start right at the moment the truth came out. When Nick Leeson fled Singapore, he left behind that note, "I'm sorry." But those two words didn't even begin to explain the chaos he left behind. As investigators opened his accounts, confusion turned into horror. The so-called error account wasn't just a temporary holding place for tiny mismatches. It held hundreds of millions in hidden losses. The official figure came to just over £800 million, enough to wipe out the entire bank's capital twice over. Barings was done for. The Bank of England was immediately alerted. A crisis meeting was held behind closed doors, and within hours, phone lines across Europe and Asia were burning with frantic calls. Could Barings be rescued? Could another bank buy its remaining assets before a total collapse triggered wider panic? In the 1990s, financial systems were becoming more interconnected by the day, so a failure like this could ripple across continents. The regulators knew they couldn't afford to let panic spread. But there was no amount of emergency cash big enough to patch such a massive hole. News cameras swarmed outside Barings' London headquarters. Employees walked out carrying boxes of personal items, still stunned. Some had been working there for decades, believing they were part of one of the safest institutions in the world. To them, the very idea that an operation in Singapore could erase 2 centuries of legacy felt surreal. But that's exactly what had happened. The next headline read like something out of a movie. The Dutch banking giant ING had acquired Barings for the symbolic price of £1. Imagine that. A world-renowned bank sold for less than a metro ticket. Now, let's talk about the investigation that followed, because it's here where the full picture came to light. Teams of auditors, regulators, and legal experts spent months combing through the wreckage. They discovered a breathtaking chain of failures, all connected to weak controls and misplaced trust. Leeson wasn't a criminal mastermind with unlimited resources. He exploited a system so poorly managed that it practically invited disaster. The warning signs had been there all along: misfiled reports, missing approvals, discrepancies in cash flows. But nobody acted. The system had become addicted to good news. London's financial world entered a state of collective denial. Senior managers claimed ignorance, saying Leeson had tricked them. Auditors said they had followed protocol, but admitted they hadn't fully understood his complex derivative positions. Regulators pointed fingers at Barings' management for allowing one man to control both trading and settlement functions. It was an endless loop of blame. The truth was simpler. Everyone trusted the profits too much to ask questions. When money flows upward, scrutiny tends to flow the other way. For the global financial regulators, this case was a wake-up call like no other. Never before had a single trader caused such devastation on his own. The old assumption that checks and balances inside big banks made them safe was shattered. New words like operational risk and internal control frameworks suddenly became part of every bank's vocabulary. If you've ever wondered why modern trading desks have dozens of compliance officers, independent risk teams, and strict separation of duties, you're looking at lessons carved directly from Barings' fall. The audit reports were devastating. Barings' risk management was described as wholly inadequate, a polite way of saying non-existent. No independent department had been tracking the size of Leeson's contracts. Senior staff didn't understand derivatives deeply enough to challenge him, and the local Singapore branch allowed him to sign his own confirmations. Can you imagine? It was as if he played chess with himself and declared victory every time. The system trusted numbers without context, forgetting that numbers are only as honest as the people producing them. The regulators didn't just scold, they rebuilt the rulebook. In the wake of Barings, central banks and financial authorities worldwide began creating new standards to prevent similar disasters. Traders were no longer allowed to oversee their own settlements. Risk management became a full-scale department rather than a background role. Banks introduced daily reconciliation of trades, independent audits, and mandatory rotation of staff in key positions. What seems like obvious best practice now was a direct reaction to one bank's spectacular failure. Meanwhile, Nick Leeson's personal story took its own turn. After fleeing Singapore, he tried to vanish under a fake name, but international warrants made that impossible. He was arrested in Germany later that year and extradited to Singapore to stand trial. The image of the once celebrated trader now wearing handcuffs became a symbol of justice catching up. In court, he pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud and forgery, receiving a sentence of 6.5 years in prison. The nation that had once admired him now saw him as the ultimate warning sign of what blind ambition can do. While Leeson served his time, Barings' name faded into history. ING absorbed what little was left of its operations and rebranded the business. The royal warrant that once allowed Barings to manage the Queen's accounts quietly disappeared. Economists, journalists, and academics began dissecting the case from every angle. Some focused on psychology, how pressure and ego can twist decision-making. Others analyzed structural failure, how institutions can collapse when rules are too loose and oversight too trusting. The conclusion was always the same. Even old institutions can be fragile if they stop adapting. You might be wondering, did Barings' downfall make the financial world safer? The answer is yes, but only partially. Rules got stricter and oversight improved, but the human factors, greed, overconfidence, denial, never true. What made Barings' example so powerful was that it removed the illusion of immunity. Big banks loved to believe they were too established, too careful, too prestigious to fall. But money doesn't respect history. In finance, survival depends not on age or tradition, but on vigilance. One misplaced trust, one overlooked detail, and centuries of success can vanish overnight. That's not just true for banks. It's true for governments, corporations, and even personal finance. The collapse also reshaped the relationship between regulators and financial institutions. Before 1995, the tone was often cozy. Regulators trusted banks to police themselves. After Barings, that era ended. Regular stress tests, detailed reporting requirements, and independent supervision became the norm. The old-school handshake culture of trust was replaced by documentation, audits, and accountability. It was less charming, but far safer. For investors and ordinary people, the story carried moral weight. It showed that transparency isn't just a bureaucratic nuisance, it's the foundation of safety. Imagine if one of your investment platforms today let a single person move billions without checks. Unthinkable, right? Yet that's exactly what Barings allowed.
The global lesson was simple but hard-earned. Transparency protects not only companies, but the public's confidence in the whole system. There's something almost tragic about how Barings' story mirrors so many human failures. Pride blinded the leadership. Ambition blinded the trader. They weren't evil, just overconfident. That's what makes this case resonate even today. In a world of algorithms and supercomputers, the root cause of financial disasters still comes down to psychology. Money magnifies whatever is already inside us. Discipline or recklessness, humility or arrogance. When the dust finally settled, Barings became a case study taught in every business and finance school. It wasn't just about financial instruments, but about human systems breaking down. Even risk management software, no matter how advanced, can't stop an organization that chooses comfort over curiosity. If we zoom out, the Barings story becomes less about one man losing billions and more about a culture forgetting to ask why when everything looks perfect. By the late 1990s, Nick Leeson was released from prison early for good behavior. He had lost everything: his marriage, his career, and his reputation. He later wrote about his experience, reflecting on how pressure, denial, and the illusion of control pushed him into catastrophe. It didn't absolve him of responsibility, but it did make his story human again. He wasn't a criminal genius. He was an ordinary man trapped by extraordinary circumstances, and his fall carried lessons for every ambitious professional alive. In the corridors of banking power, though, the fear of another Barings lingered. Regulators insisted on exhaustive systems of accountability. Banks spent millions upgrading software, training compliance teams, and creating independent reporting lines. Every big trade now required signatures, cross-checks, and verification. In many ways, modern finance owes its layers of control to the collapse of that one bank. The scars of 1995 reshaped the entire industry. So, when you hear about financial rules today, those tedious layers of verification, those endless compliance screenings, remember they exist for a reason. Each one is a barrier built after a disaster. The next time someone says, "Trust me, I have it under control," you might remember Barings and think twice, because trust is priceless until it's misplaced. As the world moved on, Barings' ghost lived quietly in the regulatory reforms of the new century. The bank that once symbolized stability became a warning about complacency. The fall reminded everyone, from traders to CEOs, that risk never sleeps. The next time we meet, we'll talk about what those lessons really mean today and why the same mistakes keep repeating despite all the warnings. For now, remember this: no system is unbreakable, and no institution too old to fail. Every financial disaster leaves behind more than balance sheets and headlines. It leaves a trail of lessons, some learned, others ignored. The collapse of Barings Bank wasn't just a story about one rogue trader. It was a mirror reflecting everything fragile about modern finance. You could call it a cautionary tale carved in pounds and panic. Even today, decades later, its shadow lies quietly in the background of every major institutional rule, every compliance meeting, and every lecture about risk. Let's begin with the most obvious takeaway. Trust is not a control system. The management at Barings trusted Nick Leeson almost blindly. To them, he wasn't just an employee. He embodied the exciting new frontier of modern finance. Young, aggressive, ambitious. They confused confidence with competence. That simple mistake cost them everything. Trust can make teams fast and efficient, but when it replaces verification, it turns toxic. The old saying goes, "Trust but verify," and Barings learned that the hard way. Another powerful lesson is about separation of duties. This might sound bureaucratic, but it's essential. No single person should ever control both the creation and confirmation of transactions. At Barings, Leeson was allowed to be both the trader who made the bets and the operations manager who verified them. That's like letting a student grade their own exam with no teacher in sight.
Financial institutions spent the next decade building systems that divided these roles firmly. It wasn't about distrust. It was about survival. There's a deeper human layer here, though. The psychology of denial played a starring role in this saga. Leeson convinced himself he could fix it all. Every trader knows the gut punch of a bad loss, but most stop before ruin. Leeson didn't. He believed that doubling down was rational, that another shot could wipe away the mistakes. That's not just financial arrogance. It's human under pressure. We all hate admitting we're wrong. The bigger the mistake, the harder the confession becomes.
That same denial infected the managers back in London. When profits looked too good to be true, they still didn't ask questions. They believed the illusion because it was comfortable. It's what psychologists call the normalcy bias, the tendency to assume everything's fine because that's easier than facing catastrophe. In hindsight, that mindset appears absurd, but it happens every day in different forms. From governments ignoring economic bubbles to companies overlooking security flaws, the signs are always there. We just choose to look away until it's too late. Now, if we zoom out, Barings teaches something even larger about systems and incentives. The bank's internal reward structure glorified short-term wins. The more you made, the higher your bonus. Accountability, on the other hand, was vague and distant. That kind of culture doesn't breed caution. It breeds carelessness. When success is celebrated instantly, but failure is deferred, people take risks they shouldn't. Leeson was simply a reflection of the incentives placed around him. Change the culture, and you change the outcome. You might think these lessons are permanent, but human memory in finance tends to be short. After Barings came the dot-com crash, then the subprime crisis, then rogue traders again, each time with people saying, "We've fixed it now." But each time, the same pattern returns. Overconfidence, hidden risks, institutional denial. It's almost poetic how predictable it is. The moment the market booms, due diligence fades, and we start believing that cleverness can beat caution. Let's make this more personal for a second. Think about your own financial decisions, investments, credit, even career moves. How often do you rely on gut feeling over data, or hold on to a bad bet because you don't want to admit defeat? That impulse drives both small traders and multinational banks alike. It's why risk management isn't just about spreadsheets, it's about psychology. Discipline is the difference between a smart investor and a reckless gambler. From a regulatory point of view, the Barings collapse brought some good changes. It accelerated the modernization of global financial oversight. Regulatory bodies tightened capital requirements, forced transparency in derivatives trading, and required independent risk reviews. Banks introduced Chinese walls, separating departments to prevent conflicts of interest. Compliance stopped being a footnote and became a core pillar of survival. The cost of these measures was high, but nowhere near as high as losing trust in the system entirely. One could argue that Barings' death birthed a stronger financial world. But there's also a darker truth. The same reforms that protect us also make systems more complex. Modern banks operate with massive compliance networks, risk software, and oversight committees. Yet, as history shows, no software can completely eliminate human temptation. Rules can only slow the fall, not erase it. Leeson's ghost reminds us that human creativity, when misapplied, always finds loopholes. The irony is that Barings' reputation for prudence was its biggest weakness. Employees were too proud of that history to imagine failure. In psychology, that's known as the halo effect, the assumption that good past performance guarantees future reliability. Institutions fall into this trap all the time. A company that succeeded for 200 years believes it's invincible. A trader with one lucky streak believes they're a genius. And just like that, caution becomes optional. For the ordinary investor or curious viewer, this story goes beyond banking. It's about how we perceive control. Markets, like life,
are shaped by uncertainty. You can plan, calculate, and hedge, but black swan events, the unpredictable shocks, will always arrive. Barings didn't fail because of one earthquake or one bad week. It failed because no one planned for the unimaginable. Risk isn't just math, it's a philosophy. It means expecting the unexpected and surviving it. You might also see parallels between Barings and the rise of modern digital finance. Think about crypto exchanges and decentralized platforms. New frontiers with old temptations. For every innovation, there's always someone testing the boundaries of oversight. History doesn't repeat word for word, but it rhymes beautifully. The tools change, but the human behaviors don't. Overconfidence, secrecy, and blind trust have crashed systems before, and they will again. Looking at Nick Leeson decades later, it's tempting to label him the villain, but the lesson is subtler. He wasn't alone in his failure. The system endowed him with too much power and too little supervision. His arrogance grew in an environment that rewarded results over ethics. Does that excuse him? Not at all. But it shifts part of the blame to the culture that let it happen. A culture that even today lurks in boardrooms whenever profit overshadows prudence. There's also a moral takeaway worth mentioning. Success without integrity is a time bomb. Leeson's story became a lesson not just for banks, but for anyone chasing quick wins. We live in a world that glorifies speed and disruption, but sometimes slowing down to question things is the smartest move you can make. If you're in a position of trust, whether handling money, data, or people, transparency isn't a luxury, it's a duty. Barings' fall showed how interconnected global finance had become. Losses in Singapore translated into bankruptcy in London, a sign of the world we now live in, where one mistake can ripple across borders. That's why financial literacy matters more than ever. Understanding how the system works isn't just for traders or regulators. It's for everyone whose life is touched by markets, which is, let's be honest, all of us. Your mortgage, your savings, your job, they all depend on invisible networks of trust. By the late 1990s, the world had moved on, but the legacy remained. Leeson emerged from prison, older, reflective, and unexpectedly philosophical. He gave talks about risk, wrote about accountability, and rebuilt a normal life. Meanwhile, the financial world kept evolving. Faster trading, bigger algorithms, more data. Yet, beneath all that progress, the same fragile human psychology waited to make the next mistake. Technology may change the tools, but it doesn't change the user. There's a haunting poetry to Barings' story. It's the tale of a man who tried to beat the market and lost, of a bank that thought its history guaranteed immortality, and of a system that forgot humility until it was too late. But if you listen carefully, it's also a story of hope. Every collapse forces an evolution. Every scandal builds a layer of awareness. The human race learns slowly, painfully, but it learns. So here's the final message. Never confuse longevity with safety, and never confuse success with strength. Whether you're running a bank or managing your own savings, the same rule applies. Always ask questions, especially when things look perfect. Because perfection is often the most dangerous illusion of all. And if the tale of Barings Bank teaches us anything, it's that vigilance, not tradition, is what truly keeps a system alive. Nick Leeson may have been the match, but the fire was already waiting to ignite. The lesson for the rest of us is simple but crucial. Never let comfort blind you, and never underestimate the cost of unchecked ambition. The markets will always find a way to humble those who think they're too clever to fail. And with that, the story of Barings closes, not as a tragedy of one man, but as a timeless reminder that even the oldest institutions can crumble when they stop paying attention.